Most emotional pain does not come from what happens to us, but from what remains unconscious within us. We relive the same wounds, not because life is cruel, but because something inside is asking to be seen. The mind calls it bad luck. The soul calls it unfinished business. Pain becomes a cycle when it is resisted. What we deny does not disappear, it waits, and what waits grows louder. Emotional suffering repeats itself because the inner conflict has not been acknowledged, named, or integrated. The same faces change, the same situations return, and we wonder why healing feels impossible. The spiritual principle that breaks this cycle is awareness without judgment. When pain is met with honest attention rather than avoidance, it loses its power to control behavior from the shadows. Awareness does not try to fix, suppress, or escape pain. It listens. It allows the hidden parts of the self to speak. Every emotional trigger points to something unresolved within. The reaction is not the problem, it is the message. When attention turns inward, the wound begins to reveal its meaning. Pain transforms when it is understood, not when it is fought. What once felt like punishment becomes guidance. The moment we stop identifying ourselves as victims of our emotions, a shift occurs. We realize pain is not an enemy but a signal. It shows where the self has been divided, where truth has been sacrificed for approval, safety, or survival. Healing begins when these split parts are welcomed back into consciousness. Integration is the true spiritual act. When opposing feelings are allowed to coexist, strength and vulnerability, fear and desire, the psyche regains balance. Emotional pain dissolves not because it was erased, but because it no longer needs to repeat itself to be heard. Freedom comes when we understand this. What you face consciously frees you, what you avoid unconsciously controls you. The cycle ends not through escape, but through inner honesty, and in that honesty, pain completes its purpose and releases its hold. Emotional pain does not repeat because life lacks mercy, but because something within remains unrecognized. When inner conflicts stay outside awareness, they continue to shape thoughts, reactions, and choices from the shadows. The psyche seeks completion, and whatever is unfinished within us will return in disguised forms until it is consciously met. What feels like recurring misfortune is often the same inner struggle asking for acknowledgement through different situations. Unseen conflicts are born early, often as adaptations to survive emotionally. Parts of the self are silenced to maintain belonging, approval, or safety. Desires are suppressed, anger is buried, vulnerability is hidden, and fail to gain attention. Unconscious conflicts also distort perception. Neutral events feel threatening. Ordinary disappointments feel catastrophic. The past leaks into the present, coloring reality with emotional memory. The individual believes they are responding to what is happening now, unaware that they are reliving something unfinished. This creates confusion and exhaustion, as the same emotional landscape is walked repeatedly with no sense of progress. Awareness changes the nature of pain. When attention turns inward, emotions slow down. Instead of reacting, one begins to observe. In that observation, the emotional charge reveals its origin. What once felt overwhelming becomes intelligible. The pain loses its urgency because it has finally been seen. Awareness does not remove the emotion, but it removes its compulsion to repeat. When inner conflicts are brought into consciousness, they no longer need to announce themselves through suffering. The psyche relaxes because the divided parts of the self are no longer at war. Emotional pain completes its function once it is understood. What repeats is not pain itself, but the refusal to see what it carries. When the unseen is made visible, the cycle quietly dissolves. Suffering deepens not because pain is unbearable, but because it is resisted. The moment an experience is labeled as unacceptable, the psyche tightens around it. Resistance creates inner friction, and that friction multiplies the original discomfort. What might have been a passing emotion becomes an enduring struggle when the mind insists it should not be there. The energy used to fight pain keeps it alive, giving it structure, memory, and continuity. Resistance takes many forms. It appears as denial, distraction, rationalization, or relentless self-improvement. Each form sends the same message inward. This feeling is dangerous and must be eliminated. Yet emotions do not respond to force. They respond to recognition. When rejected, they retreat into the unconscious, where they continue to influence behavior indirectly. The individual believes they have moved on, while the unresolved emotion quietly shapes decisions, relationships, and self-perception. The paradox is that resistance gives pain its identity. By pushing against an emotion, one defines the self in opposition to it. This creates a split between who one believes they should be and what they actually feel. The inner division becomes more painful than the original emotion. Anxiety grows around the fear of feeling, sadness turns into shame, and anger transforms into guilt. The suffering expands because the self is no longer whole. Awareness operates differently. It does not argue with experience or attempt to control it. Awareness simply notices what is present without adding judgment or urgency. In that noticing, something subtle shifts. The emotion is no longer alone in the dark, it is held in consciousness. This presence changes its quality. What was chaotic becomes defined, what was overwhelming becomes tolerable. The feeling begins to move instead of remaining fixed. Awareness also restores proportion. When an emotion is observed, it is seen as a state rather than an identity. One is no longer anger, fear, or grief. One is experiencing it. This separation loosens the grip of suffering. The emotion is allowed to rise, express its message, and pass through. Nothing is suppressed and nothing is exaggerated. The psyche regains its natural rhythm. Transformation occurs not because pain is eliminated, but because its function is fulfilled. Every emotion carries information about inner needs, boundaries, and truth. When awareness listens, the message is received. Once received, the emotion no longer needs to persist. It fades naturally without force. The suffering that once felt endless reveals itself as temporary and meaningful. Through awareness, resistance dissolves. The self becomes spacious enough to hold conflicting feelings without collapse. In that space, pain loses its authority. It no longer demands attention through intensity because it has already been acknowledged. What once caused suffering becomes a doorway to clarity, and the struggle ends not through victory, but through understanding. Pain is often interpreted as evidence of failure, weakness, or wrongdoing, yet this interpretation deepens suffering rather than resolving it. When pain is seen as punishment, the mind searches for blame either within or outside. This creates shame, resentment, and resistance, all of which obscure the true function of pain. In reality, pain is not imposed to harm, but to communicate. It emerges as a signal from within, pointing towards something that requires attention, adjustment, or truth. Emotional pain arises when there is a misalignment between inner reality and outer living. It appears when feelings are denied, values are compromised, or parts of the self are silenced to maintain stability or acceptance. The psyche responds to this imbalance by producing discomfort, not out of cruelty but out of intelligence. Pain interrupts routine. It demands reflection. It slows forward movement so that inner conditions can be examined rather than ignored. When pain is misunderstood as punishment, it is met with fear. The individual tries to escape it quickly, suppress it, or distract from it. In doing so, the message remains unread. Pain then intensifies, not to torment but to be heard. Like an alarm ignored, it grows louder. What feels relentless is often a sign of prolonged misunderstanding, not severity of damage. Pain also carries specificity. Different forms of suffering point to different inner conditions. Anxiety often signals unacknowledged fear or loss of control. Sadness may indicate grief that was never given space. Anger can reveal violated boundaries or suppressed truth. These emotions are not moral judgments, they are information. When decoded, they guide the individual back towards psychological balance. Understanding pain as a message transforms the relationship with it. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" the question becomes, "What is this trying to show me?" This shift reduces self-blame and opens curiosity. The emotion softens under attention. It no longer needs to defend itself through intensity. Awareness becomes a listening space where pain can complete its function. Pain also preserves integrity. It prevents the self from drifting too far from authenticity. When a life is built on denial, adaptation, or fear, pain acts as a corrective force. It exposes the cost of living against one's inner truth. In this way, pain is protective. It safeguards the deeper self from permanent fragmentation. Once the message is understood, pain changes form or fades entirely. It does not linger without purpose. Its continuation usually indicates that its meaning has not yet been integrated. When the insight is embodied, when choices, boundaries, or self-understanding shift accordingly, the psyche restores equilibrium. Pain recedes because it is no longer needed. Seeing pain as communication rather than punishment restores dignity to suffering. It removes the idea of cosmic injustice and replaces it with inner intelligence. Pain becomes a guide rather than an enemy, and when its message is received with honesty, it releases its hold, having fulfilled the role it was always meant to play. Healing does not begin when discomfort disappears, but when it is understood. Suppression may offer temporary relief, yet it leaves the underlying wound intact. When emotions are pushed away, silenced or masked, they do not dissolve. They retreat into the unconscious, where they continue to influence thoughts, behaviors, and perceptions. What is suppressed does not lose its power, it gains it, operating invisibly and repeatedly. Suppression often develops as a survival strategy. At some point, expressing certain feelings may have felt unsafe, unacceptable, or too costly. His psyche learned to adapt by hiding pain, anger, grief, or fear. This adaptation once served a purpose, but when carried into later life, it becomes a source of fragmentation. Parts of the self are excluded from awareness, creating an inner division that quietly drains energy and authenticity. Understanding works differently. It invites what was hidden back into consciousness without forcing it to change. To understand an emotion is not to justify it or indulge it, but to see it clearly. When an emotion is allowed to be examined, its origins become visible. Patterns reveal themselves. One begins to recognize when a present reaction belongs to a past experience. This recognition loosens the grip of repetition. Suppression freezes emotional experience in time. The feeling remains exactly as it was when it was first rejected, unchanged and unresolved. Years later, it can resurface with the same intensity, surprising the individual with its force. Understanding allows the emotion to evolve. It gives the psyche a chance to process what was once overwhelming. Now, with greater awareness and inner resources, healing requires contact. An emotion must be felt, named, and related to consciously. This contact transforms raw sensation into meaning. Fear becomes information about vulnerability. Anger becomes insight into violated boundaries. Sadness becomes recognition of loss. When meaning is found, the emotion no longer needs to demand attention through distress. Understanding also restores wholeness. By acknowledging all inner states, even those deemed unacceptable, the self becomes less divided. Inner conflict softens as previously rejected aspects are integrated. This integration does not remove pain instantly, but it removes the sense of being at war with oneself. The nervous system relaxes when it no longer needs to maintain inner defenses. Healing unfolds as clarity replaces confusion. The individual stops reacting blindly and begins responding consciously. Choices become aligned with inner truth rather than fear of feeling. Over time, suppressed emotions lose their urgency because they have been heard. Understanding completes what suppression interrupts. It allows the psyche to finish what it began, and in that completion, genuine healing takes place. Inner conflict arises when the psyche divides itself in order to cope. Certain qualities are accepted and strengthened, while others are rejected, hidden, or labeled as dangerous. This division creates the illusion of control, yet it quietly produces imbalance. The self becomes organized around avoidance rather than truth. What is disowned does not vanish. It continues to exist beneath awareness, pressing for recognition and influencing life indirectly. Opposing inner parts are not errors in the psyche, but expressions of its complexity. Strength and vulnerability, independence and attachment, desire and restraint naturally coexist. When one side is over-identified and the other suppressed, imbalance emerges. Excessive control invites chaos. Excessive compliance breeds resentment. The psyche seeks equilibrium, and when denied, it generates tension in the form of emotional distress. Integration begins when opposing parts are acknowledged rather than judged. Instead of choosing one side as correct and the other as wrong, awareness allows both to exist within the same inner space. This does not mean acting on every impulse, but understanding each impulse's role. The rejected part often carries vitality, creativity, or truth that the conscious self lacks. Its suppression weakens the whole. When inner opposites are integrated, energy that was once spent maintaining division becomes available for growth. Emotional reactions soften because they are no longer defending against an internal enemy. Anxiety lessens when vulnerability is permitted. Anger transforms when it is recognized as a boundary signal rather than a flaw. Each integrated part contributes its function without overwhelm. In the system, balance does not come from eliminating contradiction, but from holding it consciously. The psyche matures when it can tolerate inner tension without collapsing into extremes. This capacity creates stability. One becomes less reactive, less rigid, and more responsive to life as it is rather than as it should be. Integration creates a center that is not dependent on denying any part of experience. Disintegration occurs when inner conflicts are acted out externally. Unacknowledged aggression attracts hostile situations. Denied dependency produces repeated abandonment. Life mirrors the internal split, forcing confrontation through experience. Integration interrupts this process by bringing the conflict into consciousness, where it can be reflected upon rather than reenacted. As opposing parts are integrated, identity becomes more fluid and authentic. The self no longer needs to perform a single role to feel safe. There is room for contradiction without shame. This inner inclusiveness restores psychological balance because nothing essential is excluded. The psyche relaxes when it no longer has to guard against itself. True balance emerges not as perfection but as wholeness. The individual becomes capable of strength without hardness and sensitivity without fragility. Inner harmony is not silence but dialogue. When all parts are allowed a voice within awareness, the need for inner struggle diminishes, and a grounded sense of equilibrium naturally takes its place. Emotional repetition persists when experience passes through the psyche without being fully met. Events occur, feelings arise, reactions follow, and life moves forward, yet something essential remains unprocessed. The same emotional pattern returns, not because the individual failed to learn, but because attention was never fully present. Without conscious attention, experience remains incomplete, and what is incomplete seeks continuation. Repetition is the language of the unconscious. When an emotion is not recognized in its moment of arising, it embeds itself beneath awareness and waits for a similar situation to emerge. The outer circumstances may differ, but the inner response remains familiar. This creates the illusion of fate or bad luck, while in truth it is unfinished inner work repeating itself through new forms. Conscious attention interrupts this automatic cycle. When awareness is brought to an emotional reaction, as it unfolds, the momentum slows. Instead of being carried away by habit, the individual observes sensations, thoughts, and impulses with clarity. This observation creates space between stimulus and response. In that space, choice becomes possible. The pattern can no longer run unchecked. Attention transforms emotional energy. What is noticed changes simply by being seen. An emotion that once dominated behavior begins to reveal its structure, its origin, and its purpose. It is no longer an overwhelming force, but an experience within awareness. This shift weakens the compulsion to repeat because the emotion no longer needs to manifest indirectly. Without attention, emotional reactions operate like reflexes. They bypass reflection and repeat themselves with precision. Conscious attention brings these reflexes into awareness, where they lose their automatic power. The individual recognizes familiar sensations and realizes they belong to an old pattern rather than the present moment. This recognition alone can dissolve the intensity of the reaction. Repetition also relies on identification. When a person believes they are their emotions, the cycle remains intact. Conscious attention breaks identification by revealing emotions as transient states rather than fixed truths. One begins to see anger, fear, or sadness as experiences that arise and pass, not as definitions of self. This shift loosens emotional attachment and reduces repetition. As attention becomes steady, emotional memory integrates. Past experiences are no longer PR. Projected onto present situations, the psyche updates itself. What once felt unresolved completes its process through understanding. The nervous system learns that awareness is present now, capable of holding experience without overwhelm. The cycle breaks not through effort or control, but through presence. Conscious attention completes what was left unfinished. When an emotion is fully met, it no longer needs to return. Repetition ends because its purpose has been fulfilled, and what once governed life from the shadows beck. And so the way out of emotional suffering is not found in escape, correction, or force, but in presence. When you meet your inner world with conscious attention, what once repeated loses its reason to return. Pain finishes its work. Conflicts soften into understanding. The patterns that ruled you unconsciously dissolve the moment they are seen clearly. Nothing within you needs to be destroyed or fixed, only recognized. In that recognition, the cycle ends, not because life changed, but because you did